Hook, A Strange Parcel on Baker Street, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. It was one of those cruel November mornings where the city seems determined to extinguish all warmth. London, wrapped in a fog, so thick that gas lamps glowed like mournful eyes through the murk, wore its dreariness like a shroud. Chapter 1. The smoke of 1,000 hearths mingled with coal dust in the air, weighing it down until every breath seemed to carry the taste of soot and iron. Sherlock Holmes had not left his quarters at 221B Baker Street for 48 hours. He had grown increasingly moody, having exhausted the last of his monographs and chemical experiments, and now lay sprawled in his armchair in a velvet dressing gown, his sharp eyes dulled by boredom. The only sound in the room, aside from the low crackling of the fire, was the occasional scrape of his violin bow dragging listlessly across the strings in a minor key. I was halfway through an article on mineral rights disputes in the Times Hartley. Invigorating fare when we heard the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs. She knocked, hesitated, and entered, her normally composed features drawn and pale. "This came just now," she said, holding out a small, square package wrapped in coarse butcher paper. No name, no return address, delivered by hand. But the boy who brought it wouldn't say a word. He just thrust it into my hands and ran off into the fog. Holmes stirred, not unlike a hound scenting the first trace of prey. He sat upright, pipe clenched between his teeth, and gestured for her to set it on the table between us. "You've not tampered with it, I presume?" he asked. "Of course not, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice slightly trembling. "Something about it, something's wrong." Holmes leaned in. The package was unremarkable, at first glance ordinary brown paper, tied with common twine, but the handwriting on its surface gave pause. Jagged, angular letters in dark ink, each one seemingly etched with frantic precision. There was no stamp, no indication of origin. With gloved fingers, Holmes untied the twine and peeled back the paper. A scent immediately filled the earthy pungent with a cloying sweetness. That turned my stomach. Inside was a small wooden box, polished but scratched. Its hinges creaked as Holmes lifted the lid, revealing a single human bone nestled in velvet lining. A metacarpal, if I judged correctly, yellowed, weathered, and bearing distinct scraping marks along one edge. Lying atop the velvet was a small scrap of parchment. Holmes lifted it delicately and read aloud. "I have taken only what they discarded. The rest lies beneath the crows." BC, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft leaking under the door. "Good God, Holmes," I muttered. "Is it real?" Holmes nodded grimly, lifting the bone to the light. "Human, likely female. Left hand, mid-20s. See this slight curvature here? It's an artist or seamstress, perhaps, but the marks, these are not made by teeth. They're deliberate, finely honed." He closed the lid and sat back. "This is no prank, Watson. This is an overture. A summons." "A summons," I echoed. "To horror," he said, steepling his fingers. "And perhaps something far older than we suspect." He sniffed the bone, then examined the velvet interior with his magnifying lens. After several moments of intense silence, he looked up with that peculiar gleam in his eye, the gleam that told me danger was near, and that he welcomed it like an old friend. "Watson, fetch your coat. We are going to Blackheath. By early afternoon, the cab dropped us at the edge of the Blackheath Kimona, desolate expanse on the southeastern fringe of London. The fog had only thickened, and the occasional gust of wind carried the scent of wet leaves and decaying wood. It was a place that felt forgotten, the kind of terrain where secrets festered undisturbed. We made our way through the common toward the Church of St. Hilda, a small Gothic structure with weather-worn stones and a crooked steeple. Its graveyard stretched outward in uneven rows, some headstones leaning as though whispering confessions to one another. As we passed through the rusted iron gate, a figure emerged from behind a crumbling mausoleum, thin and stooped, with a gaunt face and a patchy beard. He looked more corpse than caretaker. "Mr. Holmes," he rasped. Holmes nodded. "Mr. Calder, I presume you're the groundskeeper here." 37 years, he replied, "and not once in that time have I seen the dead disturbed in such a manner." Beckoned us to follow him between the gravestones to a row of recent disturbances. The soil at 3 separate sites had been turned, as if the graves had been opened and hastily covered again. The grass had not yet regrown, and in one case, the splinters of a shattered coffin lid still poked through the dirt. "No valuables missing," Calder said grimly. "Not jewelry, not clothes, just parts, bones, taken from the corpses, like someone harvesting turnips." "Were the graves inspected after burial?" Holmes asked. "By the vicar and the coroner. One body was missing a hand, another, her jawbone gone, and the last, no ribs on the left side, nothing else touched. All of them women." A silence passed between us, heavy as the clouds overhead. Holmes knelt by the disturbed earth and removed a small vial from his coat. Dipping a glass rod into the soil, he examined it closely, sniffing once. "High content of lime and clatypical for Blackheath, but this trace here," he said, holding it to the light. "Manganese oxide, often found in embalming residue, and rarely in certain preservation techniques used in anatomical theaters. Curious." Inspector Fenchurch came to look, Calder added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Young lad, sharp, said he'd return with backup. That was 5 days ago. No word since. He's not at his station, just vanished." Holmes looked up sharply. A vanished inspector, disfigured graves, and a bone mailed to me like a calling card. He rose, brushing soil from his gloves. "Watson, we are dealing with a collector, methodical one. This is not random desecration, it is an act of selection." "For what purpose?" I asked, not certain I wanted an answer. "That," Holmes said, "is what we must discover. It's quickly." Back at Baker Street, the afternoon gave way to dusk, and the world outside turned the color of lead. Holmes had spread half a dozen burial records across the floor, marking each name with pins and threads. The mantel sat the wooden box, unopened now, as though containing something too profane to display. He had requested parish records, anatomical texts, and even a catalog of rare books from the British Museum by telegram. As he pored over the documentation, his face turned grave. "Each victim," he muttered, "was a known volunteer for medical studies at St. Bartholomew's, yet none were dissected. They were buried with full rites, and yet," he trailed off, "and yet someone retrieved their bones after the fact." I said. Holmes nodded. "Someone who believes the discarded remains of the living still hold power, perhaps knowledge, perhaps something else." Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. I stood by the fire, glancing again at the handwritten note. "I have taken only what they discarded. The rest lies beneath the crows." "Do you think he's still watching?" asked Holmes quietly. Holmes turned from his notes, pipe clenched in his teeth. "I think," he said slowly, "he's waiting for us to play our next move." The consultation, Whispers in the Earth, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson, the next morning found Holmes already at work. His sleeves rolled high and his fingers blackened with ink, chalk dust, and what I suspected to be a trace of bone ash. Velvet box sat closed on the side table, now treated more as evidence than relic. But its grim presence cast a shadow over the room, even in silence. The fire snapped and popped against the encroaching cold, and I stirred my tea absently, watching as Holmes paced with that peculiar energy that accompanied his most troubling cases, his movements sharp, mathematical, as if trying to trace an ant. invisible geometry only he could perceive. It is not just the desecration of graves that concerns me, Watson, he muttered, flicking open a parish registry, nor merely the choice of remains. It is the pattern, the guiding structure of this collector's purpose. The precision of it. He jabbed a finger at a name: Adelaide Fernwell, age 27, buried November 6. Artist, suffered a fall from a staircase, fractured wrist, healed incorrectly before death. This peculiar injury, one I believe matches the curvature I noted on the metacarpal we received. Do you mean to say this bone came from her hand? Indications suggest as much. And if I am correct, he tapped the registry again. She was buried 5 days before the first reported grave disturbance. Our collector is acting swiftly, but he is not choosing victims at random. Keys targeting women who were marked, and life artists, singers, dancers, siege, possessing bodies shaped by expressive skill. Holmes turned toward the window, peering into the gray smother of the morning fog. The collector takes only what he deems unique. Bones that performed. There is intent. At that moment, there came a sharp rap at the door. I rose to answer it and found a lean, dark-haired man in a crumpled greatcoat standing in the hallway, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Inspector Fenchurch?" I asked, startled. He pushed past me into the sitting room without invitation, visibly shaken, his eyes sunken and darting like a cornered animal. "I shouldn't have come," he whispered. He knows when people talk. Holmes's expression didn't change, but he offered the inspector a seat and poured him a stiff measure of brandy, which the man downed in a single swallow. He set the glass down with a trembling hand. "I went to Blackheath," Fenchurch said, after the second report from Calder. "The grave robberies. I saw the sights. Even took a sample back with meat scrapings from the coffin wood, odd fibers from the surrounding soil. Then I found something." Holmes leaned in slightly. "What was it?" The inspector hesitated. "A cellar beneath the church, bricked up, partially collapsed, looked ancient. It doesn't appear on any of the floor plans, but the smell coming from it." He shook his head as though trying to dislodge the memory. It was like death steeped in time. I went back the next day with the constable. The opening was concealed over, ordered fresh. Holmes's brows drew together. Someone covered their tracks. Fenchurch nodded. "Not just that. Someone was watching. I saw them. A figure high up on the ridge near the western graves. Didn't move, just stared. And when I turned my back for even a moment, he was gone. I felt a chill settle into my spine. I've reported none of this to your superior," Holmes said flatly. The inspector looked down. "Would you? I'd be laughed out of the yard. Chasing ghosts in old tombs, that's what they'd say." Holmes stood and retrieved a folded map of Blackheath, spreading it across the table. He marked the church, then drew a radius outward. "There are 3 natural ridges along this arc. Each provides a full view of the western grave plots. If our watcher stood there, he had full command of the scene without being detected. Less, you knew where to look." He turned to Fenchurch. "We'll return to the site. Tonight." "Tonight," I echoed. Holmes nodded. "Under cover of darkness, our quarry may reveal more than he intends. The fog will work in our favor." Fenchurch rose as if to object, but Holmes silenced him with a single glance. "Q came to us, Inspector, which means you want this solved as much as we do. But I advise caution. From this moment on, you are no longer investigating this alone." That evening, under cover of an ink-black sky, we returned to Blackheath. The fog was thicker still, curling around gravestones like pale fingers. Holmes carried a lantern shielded by thick glass, casting a narrow beam. Fenchurch led the way in silence, guiding us along the northern path to the ridge he had indicated. From this vantage point, We could see the church silhouetted in the distance, its spire like a finger accusing the heavens. The graveyard stretched below us in a patchwork of crumbling stone and turned earth. We waited for nearly 2 hours. Nothing stirred. A dog barked in the distance. The wind moaned low through the trees. Finchurch shifted beside me, his breath visible in the cold air. Then Holmes tensed. "There," he whispered. At the far end of the yard, between two yew trees, a shape emerged thin, elongated, cloaked in shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, and in its hand glinted something metallic. We watched as the figure approached a grave one of the previously disturbed sites. It knelt, then, with surprising speed, began to dig not with a shovel, but with clawed hands. It worked with silent, fevered intensity, dirt flying in rhythmic bursts. Holmes moved before either of us could react, descending the ridge like a phantom, swift and soundless. I followed, breath sharp in my chest, Finchurch behind me, revolver drawn. By the time we reached the site, the figure had vanished, gone, as though swallowed by the mist. But the grave was open, and at its center lay a torn velvet pouch. Inside, arranged like specimens in a display, were 3 small bone finger phalanges, delicately labeled in black ink. Holmes studied them from 3 separate hands. He murmured, "None older than a month. And this pouch, it's not ordinary cloth. It's ecclesiastical brocade, torn from vestments, perhaps." He turned the pouch over and revealed a faint embroidery, a stylized crow, stitched in silver thread. Finchurch swallowed. "The note, the one you received, said the rest lies beneath the crows." Holmes stood, eyes burning. "Das. Simply the work of a madman," he said. "This is a philosophy, a ritual, possibly even a cult." I stared at the open grave, my stomach twisting. "But to what end?" I asked. Holmes looked back at the ridge, to where the figure had disappeared. "That," he said, "we may soon discover. But I fear, Watson, that this mystery walks hand in hand with death. And death, it seems, walks among the living in Blackheath." Chapter 2, Early Investigation, The Bone Choir. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The following morning dawned gray and begrudgingly. A reluctant sun filtered through the soot-streaked windows of Baker Street as I sat nursing a second cup of coffee. The memory of the night's fog-bound confrontation still clinging to my bones. Holmes, for his part, was already in motion, sharp, tireless, and disturbingly calm, as if stalking a familiar shadow rather than a new and twisted threat. He had spent the better part of the early hours poring over the velvet pouch recovered from the grave, the embroidered crow, the distinct ecclesiastical fabric, and the handwritten labels tied to each phalanx. Holmes handled them with reverence, but also clinical detachment, as though each bone told him a story he alone could read. "They're from 3 different women," he murmured, tapping his fingers on the side table where he had arranged the phalanges. 2 left index fingers and 1 right, all removed post-mortem, cleanly. Whoever did this possesses anatomical precision and a disturbing aesthetic sense. "You mean to say they're trophies?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "No, Watson," Holmes replied, rising to retrieve a chart of human bone structure from his files. "They are instruments. Pieces chosen not for sentiment, but for their uniqueness, perhaps curvature, healed fractures, ossification, like selecting the finest strings for a violin. Our collector does not merely admire these bones, he seeks to assemble them." "Into what?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lit a cigarette and exhaled toward the ceiling. "Have you ever heard of the Corral of Ossus?" I blinked. "Can't say I have. A legend, a tea, half medical, half mystical. Whispers of anatomists, particularly those working outside the Royal College who believed that human bones retained echoes of the life they once supported, that the femur of a dancer held rhythm, or the finger of a pianist retained its sensitivity, even in death. Madness, of course. But in the mid-1800s, some so-called scholars experimented with constructing what they referred to as bone, choirs assemblages of skeleton fragments designed to sing some spiritual resonance into the world. "You believe that's what we're seeing now?" asked, incredulous. "I believe our collector believes it," Holmes replied coldly, "and that makes it no less dangerous." By midday, we were on the move again. Inspector Fenchurch had secured us quiet access to St. Bartholomew's Hospital archives, specifically the anatomical records of volunteer cadavers and research subjects. The hospital, though bustling with the ill and overworked, remained a silent monument to the intersection of science and suffering. We navigated through sterile hallways and into the older West Wing, where dust floated in the shafts of light, like ash in holy water. The records room, a narrow chamber lined with shelves of weathered ledgers, smelled of parchment and ink and the faint, bitter trace of formaldehyde. As Holmes rifled through several volumes with a speed and precision that defied their age. "These women," he muttered, passing me a list he'd compiled from burial records, were not merely patients. They were participants-all subjects in a now discontinued program, therapeutic study on the neurophysical imprint of motion in trauma victims. I glanced down the names: Cadelaide Fernwell, Ruth Keller, Beatrice Mandrell. All of them suffered from injuries that altered their physical expression. Holmes continued: broken fingers in dancers, crushed vertebrae in vocalists. Each healed and each subsequently engaged in neurokinetic rehabilitation. "What are you implying? That our collector sees them as more than bones?" Atisi says, as archived repositories of human adaptation, possibly even spiritual echoes. Holmes straightened. "But there's something else." One name appears both in the hospital's study logs and the Blackheath parish death records, though not among those exhumed. He handed me a file. Eleanor Vexley, age 30, died of presumed opium overdose. Former soprano, rehabilitated post-laryngeal injury. She was buried in Blackheath 4 weeks ago, Holmes said. Unmarked grave, Pauper's Corner. Yet her name is circled in red ink in the hospital ledger. Recently, by someone reviewing these files after the fact. He stared at me. "Our collector is not finished." We arrived at Blackheath again as twilight crept over the rooftops. This time, Holmes had come prepared. He carried a physician's satchel containing not medical instruments, but implements of investigation: chalk, string, calipers, oil lamp, and a curious item I had not seen before: brass tuning fork etched with symbols I could not identify. I had it constructed based on notes from the Oss's literature, he said when I asked if there is any acoustic resonance to these so-called bone choirs. It should reveal some sympathetic vibration. I blinked. "You don't actually believe?" "Of course not," Holmes said sharply. "But our killer might." The Pauper's Corner of the graveyard. Holmes located the plot number 4 Eleanor Vexley's grave, a patch of sunken earth, halves wallowed by weeds and crumbling leaves. No headstone marked it. No flowers had been laid. Holmes knelt, brushing back the debris, and pressed the tuning fork gently into the soil. He struck it against a small stone and held it upright. Nothing. The tone rang out and died quickly. Tried a second location, 2 feet northeast. Again, silence. But on the third attempt, just above the grave's midpoint, the vibration lingered, subtly, unnaturally. The low hum of the fork continued for several seconds longer than physics should allow. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I suspected as much," he whispered. "Something's buried here that was not interred with the body." He retrieved a handspade from the bag and began digging. I joined him, feeling the weight of dusk settle on my shoulders like a shroud. 6 inches down, we struck something solid wooden, but not a coffin. It was a small, rectangular box, perhaps 10 inches long, half as wide. Holmes pried it open. Inside were more finger bones, carefully aligned, and a metal clasp resembling a hinge, with scraps of aged sheet music folded beneath them. Each bone was labeled in the same precise script, E. Vexley, C5, C8. There was even a small tuning peg, like one might find on a violin. Holmes held up the sheet music. No notes, just rests, he muttered. Silent score. We stood there, the fog thickening again as night returned. Somewhere far off, a crow called sharp, singular, and unmistakable. Holmes closed the box gently and stood. He's building something, Watson, something that cannot be heard with the ears but must be felt, in bone, in breath, in madness. Do you mean to say? He cut me off. I mean only this. Eleanor Vexley was the last piece he needed from Blackheath. His work here is complete. I looked around the yard, the silence pressing in. Then, where is he going next? Holmes exhaled slowly, eyes unreadable. If he seeks perfection, he said, then he must now move from the remains of the dead to the living. The first theory, the collector's choir, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. We returned to Baker Street with the small wooden box tucked under Holmes's arm like a sacred artifact. Neither of us spoke on the cab ride back. The silence between us wasn't discomforted, was vigilance, a tension of thought. Could see it working behind Holmes's eyes as clearly as if I had been watching gears shift inside a clockwork. He was constructing something, an internal structure of meaning, a model of the collector's design. A theory, perhaps, but not one he was ready to share. When we arrived, Holmes placed the box delicately upon the mantel, beside the first velvet case we had received by post. Case to shrines to the same unspeakable work, different in detail, but unmistakably linked by purpose. He stood before the fire, staring into the flickering coals, as though the answers lay buried beneath the ash. I've encountered madness before, he said finally, not looking at me. Murderers who believed themselves prophets, arsonists who whispered to flames. But this man does not act from madness. His actions are measured as if he follows a score written long ago, and each crime is only the next note. A ritual, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. Yes, but not religious in the conventional sense. This is not sacrifice, it is composition, a work in progress. And each bone he collects is a phrase in some unspeakable language. He turned to his writing desk and began making notes, pages upon pages of comparisons, anatomical diagrams, fragments from occult medical texts, K's, sketches of the symbols on the tuning fork, references to ancient funerary rites. Watson, I must ask something of you. Of course, you are to go to the Royal College of Surgeons first thing in the morning. Seek out Professor Ambrose Griffin. He was a colleague of mine during the garroting case of '88. And he is something of an authority on unorthodox anatomical theory. Do you mean phrenology and such nonsense? Worse, Holmes muttered. But he may understand the logic behind these selections, the connection between specific bones and psychological imprints. I need to know if anyone in the academic community has been speaking quietly about resonance in skeletal remains. And you, I shall return to Blackheath alone. I frowned. That's unwise, Holmes. He waved me off. Not a social call. There's something beneath the old church that the inspector saw an ancient cellar bricked over and forgotten. I intend to find it, okay? The following day, I found myself at the Royal College's great reading hall soaring cathedral of leather-bound volumes and dusty glass displays. The air smelled of formaldehyde and ink. Professor Griffin, a wiry man with deep-set eyes and a pince nez that never sat quite straight, welcomed me with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. You say Holmes sent you? He sniffed. still poking around in back alleys for bones. Is he? I explained the matter carefully, holding names and emphasizing only the anatomical selections, the precise phalanges, the jawbones, the patterns. Griffin's demeanor shifted. A collector, you say? He leaned forward. Not just any collector, someone with purpose. Musical structure, perhaps. Yes, I said, surprised. Holmes mentioned something called the Chorale of Ossus. Griffin's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. Ah, that dusty fable. Most dismissed it as spiritualist rubbish. But there was one anatomist who took it seriously. A German immigrant, Dr. Alaric Mulheim, claimed to be a disciple of Mesmer and a student of Schubert. He believed the human body was a kind of orchestra, and that bones retained tonal memory. Where is he now? Griffin's smile vanished. Presumed dead. Disappeared during the typhoid outbreak of 1874, but his papers were never found. Some claimed he left behind a manuscript, the silent cantata treatise on building a choir of bones capable of inducing trance states or madness, or worse. The words chilled me. Was he ever affiliated with the college? I asked. Griffin shook his head. Unofficially, he lectured once, here only, once. The talk was banned. They said he played a series of tones using mounted vertebrae, claimed it made one of the porters weep uncontrollably. Back at Baker Street, Holmes returned an hour after I'd his coat muddied, his hands scraped raw. I found it, he said without ceremony. It's a crypt beneath the church. Not a cellar, catacomb. He produced a sheaf of pages, rough sketches, and notations. Stone passages winding below the nave. Ancient, pre-Anglican, Roman, perhaps. But someone has been using them recently. Dust displaced, candles burned low, a table, metal implements, hooks along the wall. He tossed a photograph on the desk. I leaned in, showed what looked like a rib cage, hung like a harp. He's not merely collecting anymore, Watson. He's building. This is not theory now. It's execution. But what is he building toward? I asked. A performance? A final movement? Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened the second velvet box and withdrew the phalanges. He laid them in order, then struck his tuning fork and held it over them. Again, the hum lingered longer than it should. The smallest bone vibrated gently. Holmes tapped it. The tiny chime rang out. It's tuned, he said, flatly. You mean he's... Yes, our collector is crafting an instrument, and each new piece brings him closer to completion. He turned to me suddenly. Watson, we must assume he'll not stop with the dead. The performance, he imagines it, requires sound. Sound requires breath. And that, I fear, means a living component. My blood turned to ice. You mean a person? Holmes nodded. Taps more than one. Late that evening, a third package arrived. No knock, no messenger. It simply appeared on our doorstep, as if placed there by a phantom. This time, it contained no bones. Only a mask, porcelain white, shaped like a human face, but featureless save for a sculpted mouth, open as if frozen mid-song. On the inside was a smear of dried blood, and a note. You have followed well, but the crescendo awaits. B.C. Holmes stared at it a long time, then replaced it in the box with careful hands. We have until the next new moon, he said, quietly. And then, I asked. He looked at me with eyes colder than I had ever seen them. Then, the performance begins. Chapter 3, A Buried Clue, The Silent Cantata, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The porcelain mask sat like a specter in our sitting room. Its lifeless mouth, parted in a mute and eternal cry, stared at us as though daring us to ask what it had witnessed. It was delicate in craftsmanship, too delicate to be crafted by a common hand, yet unmistakably intended to disturb. Its hollow eyes reflected the firelight like the gaze of the dead. Even Holmes, who had stared down murderers with a detached glare, observed it with a strange kind of respect. He did not touch it again after placing it back in the box. Instead, he seated himself at the window, pipe between his fingers, and watched the fog roll through Baker Street as if the answer might drift in with it. The crescendo, he murmured. He believes we are nearing the end, and he is inviting us to witness it, okay? Or challenging us to stop it, I said. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he reached for the folded letter I had brought back from the Royal College, the notes of Professor Griffin regarding Dr. Alaric Mulheim and his vanished manuscript. Holmes unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the dense script until he came to a passage marked in the margin. In the theory of Mulheim, the body was never truly silent. It merely forgot how to sing. Bones, he believed, were memory incarnate. If tuned properly, they could unlock not just music, but the unspoken grief and longing that resided in the marrow of all things. Holmes tapped the line with a finger. He's not just trying to perform, Watson. He's trying to resurrect something, a soul. Holmes shook his head. A feeling, a state of being, something that was lost to him long ago. I'd wagered this man, our collector, was once a student of Mulheim, a disciple, possibly even a survivor of his failed experiments. And now he means to finish what his master began. But the manuscript was lost, I reminded him, or so we believed. He stood abruptly and crossed to the bookcase, where he began pulling volumes from the shelves, medical journals, folktale compendiums, alchemical treatises. From behind a worn copy of Cruikshank's sketches, he withdrew a folded envelope. Had Wiggins and his irregulars scoured the stalls along the Thames embankment, he explained. Dealers in oddities. A seller near Temple Bar claimed to have acquired something from a German scholar's estate written in cipher, bound in vellum, and accompanied by a symbol of a crow in silver thread. He opened the envelope and drew forth a torn fragment of parchment. The ink was faded, the language archaic German, and the script near legible. But the image drawn at the Centera circle of bones, forming a kind of sigil, was unmistakably deliberate. I believe this is a page from the silent cantata, Holmes said. And this, he pointed to a symbol near the top, matches a carving I found in the crypt wall beneath St. Hilda's. I leaned closer, conned. The symbol resembled a stylized G-glyph twisted into the shape of a spine. Along its curves were not nodes, but bone fragments, phalanges, metatarsals, vertebrae labeled with initials. Holmes traced one with his finger. Here, E.V. Eleanor Vexley. This is not a score in the musical sense. It's a ledger, a construction diagram, blueprint, I said, aghast, for building an instrument of the dead. Yes, Holmes replied softly, and our collector is nearly finished. The following morning brought a lead of an altogether different kind. A telegram arrived from Fenchurch. Have identified object matching masks. Museum of Folk Traditions, Somerset House. Exhibit removed 6 months ago. Come at once. F. Within the hour. We were riding by hansom through the narrowing lanes of Westminster, the great towers of Somerset House rising like watchful sentinels on the embankment. The Museum of Folk Traditions occupied a modest wing, housing relics of rural life, ancient rites, the oral war of the British Isles corn dolls, burial shoes, carved charms against the evil eye. Fenchurch met us just inside the threshold, looking weary but newly animated. I had one of our catalogers look into it, he said. The mask we received matches a piece from a defunct exhibit called Rites of the Hollow Voice. It toured briefly before being pulled. Why was it pulled? Holmes asked. Fenchurch glanced around. Complaints. One woman fainted while looking at the mask. Another claimed to hear a child's scream inside the exhibit room, though no child was present. He led us to a back room where a series of crates were being unpacked by white-gloved staff. From one, he retrieved a folder containing sketches and notes from the exhibit's curator. Holmes read silently, then suddenly stiffened. He held up a grainy sketch. It showed the same mask displayed atop a carved wooden pedestal. Beneath the image was a name Mulheim. The description read, "Ceremonial mask used in what is believed to be Mulheim's final lecture demonstration. Mouth open to symbolize unending resonance." The accompanying sound device has never been located. A sound device? I asked. Holmes turned to Fenchurch. What else was in the exhibit? The inspector leafed through the notes. Several small items: a jaw harp carved from bone, okay, wind flute made of spinal segments, okay, and a hearing object described as desolate Schlüssel, the final key, but it went missing during transport. The curator reported it stolen. Holmes went very still. "Can't believe," he said slowly. "That is our next buried clue." He stepped back from the table. "We must return to Blackheath, not to the graveyard, but beneath it. I believe the final key was hidden beneath the crypt where Mulheim first began his work. If the collector retrieved it recently, he is now in possession of the last component he needs." That night, we descended once more into the forgotten catacombs beneath St. Hilda's. Holmes led us with a lantern in one hand and the torn manuscript page in the other. The air was colder now, as if something deep below had stirred since our last visit. We reached a narrow corridor near the base of the eastern wall. Here, Holmes paused and traced his hand along the damp stone. After a moment, he pressed a flat iron keyer covered from the crypt's table into a notch between two bricks. There was a soft click. The wall groaned and a narrow passage opened. Beyond it, a small room lay in darkness. Inside was a single pedestal draped in black velvet. Upon it, nestled in silk, was a small object, a mouthpiece fashioned from a human jawbone, inlaid with copper and etched with musical glyphs. Holmes held it up to the light. "The final key," he murmured. "What does it do?" I asked. "Completes the instrument," Holmes replied. "And when he uses it, Watson, the collector believes he will summon something beyond death, a memory, a lamentation, a music too profound for the living to bear. And where will he perform it?" Holmes turned to me, eyes cold. "Where all music ends, Watson, in a place of echoes, false trails and suspense. The Choir Without Throats, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson Holmes, and I emerged from the catacombs just before dawn. The first gray hues of morning light struggling to pierce the London mist. We had wrapped the mouthpiece das Let's Schlussel, the final key, in a silk handkerchief and secured it within Holmes's leather satchel. He handled it carefully, as one might a vial of deadly gas, knowing it was not just a relic, but a symbol, the final stroke in a deadly symphony we were racing to interrupt. Back in Baker Street, we said little. Holmes placed the mouthpiece beside the mask and bone diagrams on our mantel, staring at them as one might contemplate a puzzle that threatened not only to remain unsolved, but to unravel the mind entirely. He did not sleep, nor did I. The hour was too laden with tension for rest, and I feared that even if I closed my eyes, I would hear that unplayed song, the one that had cost so many their lives. "I am missing something," Holmes muttered near midday, pacing like a caged hawk. One thread, one silent note. The collector believes he is building a choir, but where is the choir to perform? Or its voices? More victims? I asked. Living ones. Perhaps, Holmes said, perhaps his victims were only the preparation. There may be a substitute, a set of living vessels capable of producing the final resonance. He turned suddenly. "Watson, the asylum records Bethlehem Hospital. We must go." 2 hours later, we stood in the somber receiving hall of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, still known in whispered tones across London as Bedlam. The matron, a grim woman named Mrs. Havering, guided us through the cracked tiles and hollow corridors with brisk steps, and little warmth. "We do not typically permit outside inquiries," she said, but Inspector Fenchurch sent word to her, seeking former patients of Dr. Alaric Mulheim, Holmes said, "specifically any who may have disappeared or been released under irregular circumstances." The matron narrowed her eyes. Mulheim's tenure here ended 20 years ago. There were allegations of unorthodox treatment methods. Some patients claimed to hear music, even in silence. Others developed violent aversions to sound. One young man tore out his own eardrums with a butter knife. "His name?" Holmes asked sharply. "Lysander Hoyle." But he died shortly after, being transferred to a private sanatorium in Surrey. Did Mulheim have any devoted students? Anyone who visited him after he left? "There was a man," she said after a pause. "Thin, severe, always wore gloves, called himself Felix, came often. Asked after the patients Mulheim had treated, especially those with musical backgrounds. I always thought him hungry." Holmes's eyes lit. "And this Felix, have you seen him recently?" "No, but a parcel arrived 6 nights ago. No return address. Inside were bone fragments and a page from an old hymn book. I reported it, but no constable followed up." Holmes turned to me, voice low and clipped. "Watson, we must find that parcel." The parcel lay in the matron's locked drawer, wrapped in old cloth. Inside were 5 small bones, finger and wrist segments, each labeled in the same fine angular script we had seen before. But it was the hymn page that chilled us. Holmes unfolded it slowly, crossed the staves of faded musical notation, where streaks of rust-red ink forming a single word in German. "Whitehall Echo." Holmes stared at it long and hard. "He means to perform in a place where the sound returns, where it can't die." "The catacombs?" I offered. "No, too narrow. The sound would choke." Holmes suddenly stepped back. "It must be a hall, Watson, a place designed for acoustics, somewhere long abandoned, forgotten by the living, but perfect for the dead." We returned to London proper with grim purpose. Fenchurch met us at Scotland Yard with a fresh report. "There's been another disappearance," he said without preamble. 3, in fact, all within the last 2 days. Young women, all music students, 2 sopranos, 1 cellist. All attended a now defunct conservatory near Gray's Inn Road. Holmes's hands tightened around his cane. "Has the school been inspected?" Fenchurch hesitated. "It burned 6 years ago. Electrical fire. Structural damage made it unusable, but it was never demolished." Holmes straightened. "Where, precisely?" Fenchurch produced a map. Holmes's eyes flicked to the location, then narrowed. "Watson," he said slowly, "this building once served as a small recital chamber. Limestone interior, a domed roof." He looked at us both. A chamber designed to catch the softest breath and magnify it tenfold. "You think he's using it as the final venue?" I asked. "I believe he's been preparing it for months, perhaps years." That evening, we paid a visit to the ruins of the former Belgrave Academy of Musical Discipline. It sat like a rotting tooth along the edge of a darkened alleyway. Charred beams jutted through shattered windows, and the faint scent of scorched paper and mildew still lingered in the air. We entered with caution, our boots echoing against ash-covered marble. Holmes led the way with his lantern, ducking beneath cracked archways and collapsed plaster. So we passed through what had once been a rehearsal space, now filled with scattered sheet music and broken chairs. Then, at last, we reached the main hall. It was domed, as he'd said, blackened by fire, but still acoustically whole. The echo of our steps returned to us, strangely delayed, like whispers mimicking our movements. In the center of the room, a raised dais had been constructed. Upon it sat something. I moved closer, but Holmes stopped me with a hand on my chest. was a frame wooden and bound in silver wire. Attached to it were bones, human bones. A rib cage formed the arch. Phalanges lined the edge like keys. Jawbones were suspended copper wires tangled where chimes might be. And near the base, secured beneath the scaffold, were 3 prone figures, the missing girls, alive, unmoving, bound and gagged with strips of cloths soaked in something dark. God, I breathed. Holmes stared, eyes tight. He's not finished assembling the choir. He intends to use them, the body's resonators. He believes sound will pass through them and awaken the arrangement. And the final key, I asked. Holmes nodded grimly. Without it, he cannot begin, and he believes we have it. Suddenly, a sound split the silence, a single, haunting note from deeper in the hall, metallic, hollow, like wind through bone. Holmes stepped back, hand on his pistol. He's here. Chapter 4, The Trap, The Final Key, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The single tone had vanished, swallowed by the charred vaults of the ruined music hall. Yet its presence lingered, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Holmes stood, stock still beside me, every muscle taut, his head tilted slightly, not with fear, but calculation. I knew that look well, where in the echo he had heard more than a note. He had heard intent. We crept behind the cracked colonnade to the left of the central dais. From there, we could still see the strange bone instrument, the unholy amalgamation of remains woven into a frame manned. The 3 unconscious women laid carefully at its base like sacrificial offerings. Their chests rose and fell shallowly. Holmes signaled to me, one hand up, a warning to hold. And then, from the far side of the chamber, we saw him, the collector. Hay moved silently through a gaping arch in the wall, a tall, emaciated figure, wrapped in a long black coat, face obscured by a mask identical to the one we had received. White porcelain, lips parted in a frozen expression of ecstasy or agony. In his gloved hands, he carried a slim leather satchel. Holmes leaned in close to me, whispering he's preparing for the performance. He doesn't yet know the key is missing. I stared, breath caught in my throat. Holmes, the girls, if he begins, he won't. Holmes cut in. Not tonight. He's still tuning the choir. This is his rehearsal. We watched as the masked figure approached the dais. With a surgical delicacy, he knelt before the bone instrument. From the satchel, he drew several items, tuning forks of varying lengths, a vial of clear liquid, and an object I recognized instantly, the mouthpiece, the final key. I felt Holmes stiffen beside me. The mouthpiece, which we had locked in a drawer at Baker Street just this morning, was now in the hands of a man whose every movement suggested a chilling mastery of our every step. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. That's not possible. He pulled a small spyglass from his coat, examined the object from afar, and then drew a sharp breath. It's a replica, he said. A near-perfect one. You're certain? Yes. The carving lacks the copper inlay at the base, but it means he has seen the original. He knows it's in our possession, which means this. He gestured to the entire scene. It's not a rehearsal, Watson. It's bait. I turned toward him. You think he wanted us here? I know it. And now that he's confirmed we followed the trail, he will come for U.S. He paused, then added grimly, Good. We withdrew silently, leaving the ruined hall as ghost-like as we had entered. The collector never turned, never glanced our way. He seemed utterly absorbed in his terrible work. But as we exited through the alley into the thickening fog, I could not shake the feeling that he had known we were watching, known we would come, known Holmes would not resist the scent of a perfect hunt. Back at Baker Street, Holmes locked the true final key in a lead box and stowed it beneath a false floorboard behind the hearth. We let him think he's ahead. he said, pacing. It's the only way we get ahead. Now he believes the replica will suffice, but when he tries to play it, when his composition fails, he will seek the real instrument. I nodded slowly. And we'll be ready. Holmes raised an eyebrow. More than ready. We invite him. I stared at him. You mean to set a trap? He turned toward the desk, where he began drafting a letter in his sharp, angular hand. Not just a trap, Watson. A performance of our own. He craves an audience, but more than that, he craves completion. That's what we offer him. We give him a stage. Quote, we set the conditions, okay? And when he comes to claim the key, we'll be waiting with our own score prepared. He handed me the letter. It was addressed to the collector of echoes, C.O. Corral, of Blackheath, followed by a string of musical symbols and Latin phrases code, drawn directly from the fragment of the silent cantata we had uncovered. It will reach him, Holmes said. It's the language he understands. The trap was laid at the old Ravensbury Chapel, long since decommissioned, and now under reconstruction after a roof collapse, tease, or nearly identical to those of the Belgrave Academia domed apse, narrow stone corridors, came a gallery balcony overlooking the central chamber. Fenchurch arranged the site under pretense of a structural audit, allowing Holmes complete access. Will give him 3 paths in, Holmes explained as we surveyed the space. But only one escape, and if he refuses to take the bait, I asked. Holmes offered a rare, cold smile. He won't. We returned to Baker Street, our preparations complete, but the night came quickly, thick with fog and damp with anticipation. Holmes sat calmly by the fire, violin in hand, drawing long and somber notes from the strings music that did not soothe, but warned. Watson, he said quietly, you understand what's at stake, don't you? I nodded. You believe he will attempt to finish the composition here tonight, or die trying, Holmes replied. Men like him don't retreat. Their madness propels them toward culmination. Squire, this instrument tests not just his obsession, it's his identity. Without it, he ceases to exist. There was a knock at the door. Fenchurch entered, hat in hand, revolver at his hip. We're set, he said. Officers posted, gallery secured. No one gets in or out unnoticed. Holmes rose. Then let us attend the finale. We arrived at Ravensbury Chapel just past midnight. Candles flickered along the outer walls. Holmes's suggestion, an invitation, a trail of fire for the moth to follow. The stage was set. The replica mouthpiece displayed atop a velvet pedestal. The true artifact hidden beneath a floor tile behind the pulpit. Holmes and I took our place in the gallery. Fenchurch waited in the antechamber, armed and silent. And then movement. Figure emerged from the mist, slow and deliberate. The collector, still masked, still gloved. He crossed the threshold into the chapel and paused, just beneath the rose window. Holmes held his breath. The figure approached the altar, looked down at the mouthpiece, picked it up delicately, stared at it. Then he tilted his head slightly toward us. Holmes froze. He knows, I whispered. The collector reached into his coat. Holmes moved. Now, but before we could descend, there was a shriek of sound so high and sharp it seemed to pierce the stone. A woman's voice. The gallery window shattered. And when we looked again, the collector was gone. The confession, or catch, when the choir sings, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The rose window shattered with a scream or cry so raw it seemed to lacerate the very air. Holmes and I bolted down the narrow gallery stairs, Fenchurch close behind, the echoes of our footsteps multiplying in the vaulted stone corridor. But by the time we reached the altar, the chapel was empty. The mask lay shattered at the foot of the dais. The replica mouthpiece, too, had been discarded, rejected, like a false note in a sacred score. Holmes knelt over the fragments. Chapter 5. Aftermath. The note that would not end. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. His eyes scanned the broken porcelain, fingers delicately sorting through the scattered pieces. Gone, he muttered, not with despair, but with focus, and not just fled. He disappeared. Fenchurch crouched beside him. There's no way out. The side doors were watched. The apse is sealed. The roofs braced with scaffolding. There's no route he could have used. There's always a route, Holmes snapped. You planned the escape before you ever walk into the room. He stood suddenly, eyes turning toward the gallery's shattered window. That scream was a diversion. He knew we'd react. He counted on it. I turned to the broken glass. You don't think it was real? I think it was recorded, Holmes replied darkly. Or triggered. There are means phonographs hidden within architectural recesses. I've seen it done. But why return at all? I asked. Why take the risk if you knew it was a trap? Holmes turned toward the floor behind the altar. He pulled back a flagstone, revealing the mouthpiece's hiding place. It was empty. He stared at the vacant space for a long moment, then closed his eyes. Well played, said. Only you knew where it was, I said. I thought only. I knew, which means he's been in Baker Street, Watson, inside our rooms. I took a step back. He's violated our sanctuary. He's Holmes raised a hand, stopping me cold. He's made it personal. That was his mistake. The following morning, Baker Street felt ... changed. Disturbed. I searched every drawer, every closet, even under the rugs. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing else was missing, except the mouthpiece. Holmes examined the sitting room with meticulous care, tapping the baseboards with a tuning fork, listening for subtle resonance. When he finally sat down, folding his hands, his voice was low. He was here, and I missed him. Could have taken more, I offered. He didn't harm Mrs. Hudson. Didn't touch your notes. Doesn't want destruction, Holmes said. He wants completion. We've become part of his composition, Watson. You and I are the dissonant chords in his symphony, the only notes out of place. I said nothing. But there was something new in Holmes's voice, shame, perhaps. Or, worse, the rare taste of being outwitted. Then came the letter. It wasn't posted, no stamp, no mark X for a musical symbol drawn in graphite. 3 rib bones forming a treble clef. Inside was a single page. It's handwritten in black ink. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, conductor of chaos, keeper of silence, an unwilling listener, you mistuned. The trap, the performance, is not for interruption, but culmination. You have sought to stop what was never meant to be stopped. Tonight, they will sing. Whether you stand witness or not is your choice. The finale will be held where music once bloomed and bloomed again, only to die. Come alone. Bring no instruments of Warley, your ear. P.C. Holmes passed me the note, cryptic, but not impenetrable, where music bloomed and bloomed again, only to die. What does that mean? I asked. He turned toward the bookshelves, rifling through a stack of theater registries. There was an opera house once, he said slowly. Burned in 1871, rebuilt twice. Both times closed after tragedy. A ceiling collapse killed musicians. A soprano was poisoned during rehearsal. Finally condemned in 88. He pulled a volume from the shelf, the Amphion, near Whitechapel. They say the architect hanged himself in the balcony. They said the stage could never be made to sound right. Again that it devoured music. Arrived minutes later, summoned by Holmes's telegram. Holmes handed him the note and the location. You must cordon the surrounding streets, but do not enter unless I signal. The collector wants an audience of one. He must believe I've honored that request. I won't risk your life for a performance, Fenchurch growled. And I won't risk London for a false sense of safety, Holmes shot back. They locked eyes. But for the first time, Fenchurch's jaw tightened, not in defiance, but indifference. "We'll be ready," he said quietly. That night, the Amphion Opera House stood like a corpse. Half-collapsed brickwork, ivy-covered walls, soot-stained arches. Inside, the main hall was intact, but barely. Holmes entered alone. I watched from across the street, hidden in the broken windows of an abandoned tailor shop. Fenchurch and 2 officers stood in the shadows nearby. Holmes carried no weapon, only a walking stick and the torn page from the silent cantata folded inside his coat. Within the Amphion, all was still. Then came the music, a low vibration, at first like breath moving through a buried pipe organ. It rose gradually, building layer upon layer. No strings, no brass, just bone, hollow sound, memory. And then came the voices, female, 3. They rose and twisted into a harmonic swell that defied all natural law. No lyrics, only vowels, sound without language. Holmes stepped forward. The stage was lit. No, lanterns burned, and there he was, the collector. He stood before the bone, his instrument dash reassembled. The 3 women live stood behind it, trance-like, mouths open, eyes vacant. The final key rested at the center of the frame. Holmes spoke high. Couldn't hear what he said, but the collector turned. He removed his gloves, killed his mask. Holmes recoiled it in horror, but in recognition, the man beneath the mask was young, is no more than 30, pale, slender, eyes sunken, but filled with manic brilliance. Holmes stepped forward. Then women screamed in perfect pitch. The walls shook. The theater shuddered. The sound ripped through the stone, and then darkness. "You need rest, Holmes," I insisted, mixing a draft of laudanum for his nerves. "You cannot resume the chase in this condition." He waved the glass aside. "No laudanum, Watson. I must think. That music. It was not only sound, but memory and lamentation, as Mulheim prophesied. He harnessed the agony of these women, of himself. Every note was an echo from the city's wounds." He shuddered, pressing his hands to his ears, as though warding off the residual resonance. "You saw him?" I asked quietly. "Did you know who he was?" Holmes nodded slowly. "His name is Felix Argo. He was a prodigy cellist, admitted to Bethlehem after his collapse, a patient of Mulheim, later his acolyte. He vanished from the asylum records under a false name, resurfaced in the conservatories and medical halls, seeking those marked by trauma, searching for the right voices. But why?" I pressed. "What compelled him?" Holmes stared into the fire. He believed that by reconstructing agony, by binding it, he could free himself. Or perhaps he simply wished to make the world listen to his pain, the city's pain, our pain. The cantata was not merely music, it was confession, accusation, a wound made audible. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. "Will he hang?" I finally asked. Fenchurch, who had been listening by the door, shook his head. "He will be returned to the asylum. Court will find him unfit. He is as much a victim as any." Holmes did not argue. He merely closed his eyes and leaned back, as though surrendering to the last shivering chords of the night. Later, as the day brightened, I took a walk through the city, turning all that had happened over in my mind. Everywhere, London seemed unchanged, its people bustling through their routines, ignorant of the horrors recently hidden in its abandoned halls. And yet, beneath the surface, I sensed something had shifted. Some collective burden, some sorrow had found its voice, and, for a single, terrible moment, been heard. Returning to Baker Street, I found Holmes at the window, the broken mask and bone mouthpiece set on the sill before him. He watched the clouds, thoughtful. "Will it happen again, Kay?" I asked, gently. Holmes did not answer at first. When he did, it was with that rare honesty he reserved for the bleakest of truths. There will always be another note, Watson, another collector, another wound. But, for now, let us be grateful. The choir is silent. Closing reflection, Holmes's final note, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. It was several days before the shadow that had passed over Baker Street began to lift. Even then, it was not the sunlight that banished it, but the slow resumption of habit, the clink of teacups, the rustle of the morning papers, the gentle scolding of Mrs. Hudson over Holmes's untouched breakfasts. Yet, beneath the familiar patterns, a current of unease lingered. Holmes himself seemed thinner, drawn inward. He spoke little, and when he did, it was not to explain, but to muse in unfinished fragments. The three young women, the choir, Felix Argyle, had so obsessively constructed remained at St. Bartholomew's under close observation. I visited them daily, often with Fenchurch, who had taken a quiet, paternal interest in their recovery. The first 2 days, the girls said nothing, their eyes fixed on an invisible point somewhere beyond the hospital's walls. By the third day, however, a subtle change came over them. Celia, the eldest, asked for her violin. Marianne hummed to herself, almost unconsciously, a gentle melody at odds with the horror she'd endured. Only Rebecca remained silent, but there was a new warmth in her gaze when her parents arrived, and she wept quietly in her mother's arms. "There are wounds that do not bleed," Holmes remarked one morning, reading my notes on the women's progress. "Yet they demand time, not bandages. In that, the city is much the same." I saw his hands tremble as he set the notes aside. He had begun sleeping with the lamp burning low, a habit he'd not indulged since the case of the Hammersmith phantom. I asked if he was troubled by nightmares, but he dismissed the question with a brisk shake of the head. "My mind is a crowded stage, Watson. Each night, the players repeat their lines. Some exit, others remain." He sat back, steepling his fingers, the firelight casting angular shadows across his face. "It was not the music alone," he mused. "It was the silence that followed. It presses on the soul, demanding resolution, as a composer's unfinished symphony gnaws at the attentive listener. That, I think, was Argyle's truest torment, the longing to end what could not be ended." Fenchurch visited us late that week, hat in hand, bringing an official update. Felix Argyle had been committed to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, his mind reportedly fractured beyond repair. He spoke little now save for muttering scraps of music and lines of poetry that made sense only to him. Mulheim's name surfaced repeatedly, along with references to the lost key and the choir beneath the stones. "His trial will not proceed," Fenchurch said, quietly respectful. "The judge saw no justice in hanging a madman. The city wants to forget Holmes. They've begun repairs on the Amphion. The papers have called it a gas leak, an accident." Holmes regarded the inspector with a rare look of sympathy. "There are some truths, Fenchurch, that cannot be printed, nor should they be. Too much of London's strength lies in her refusal to be haunted by every shadow." Fenchurch nodded, but his face remained grave. "There's one matter unsettled," he said. "The manuscript, the silent cantata. The original remains lost. Argyle's notes are fragmented. There are other disciples, or copies." Holmes interrupted. "Have reason to believe Mulheim destroyed most of his work before his death. But as for disciples' obsession, is a contagion. The seeds of it have already taken root in other hearts, waiting for the right melody, the right wound." He turned to me as Fenchurch took his leave. "Burn the copy of the cantata's fragment, Watson. It has served its purpose. Let it vanish into the embers, as all dangerous things must." I did so that night, watching the ancient ink curl and blacken in the grate, even as the flames erased the twisted musical notations. I wondered whether Holmes was right, whether a thing once heard or read could ever be truly forgotten. The city pressed on. The leaves fell. The gas lamps glowed through the early fogs of December, and life fragile, persistent crept over the scars left by the collector's work. Holmes spent his days immersed in monographs and casework, though I could sense his mind wandering, troubled by chords unresolved. One evening, as the rain drummed against the panes, I found him at the mantel, studying the remains of the case's artifacts, the mask, now in shards, the lead box with its hollow velvet lining, the tuning fork that had once hummed so unnaturally in the graveyard. He lifted the fork, struck it against the marble, and listened as the tone died away, perfectly natural. Nothing left but the memory. "It's finished," I said gently. "Sid," Holmes replied, eyes still fixed on the trembling fork. "You recall, Watson, that Argyll told us London herself had taught him why to pursue such horrors. What do you think he meant?" I hesitated. London is a city built upon its own dead. Catacombs, paupers, graves, churches older than memory. Its people are taught to swallow pain and make music of silence. Holmes smiled faintly. A poet's answer. Perhaps a true one. Perhaps that is why this city breeds both genius and madness in equal measure, and why we are called again and again to solve mysteries, but to listen for the notes others cannot bear to hear. He let the tuning fork rest at last and gazed out into the darkness. The outline of his face softened by lamplight and a gentleness I rarely saw in him. "There will always be another wound, Watson, another secret. For now, let us sit and hear the city in its quietest hour." He poured tea, offered me a cup, and together we listened to the hush after horror, to the faint rumble of distant carriages, to the heartbeat of London itself. For a while, there was only peace, yet even in the silence, I knew, as Holmes surely did, that the city's next great note was waiting, already resonating beneath our feet. Chapter 6. The World Moves On. Resonances, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson in the weeks that followed the closing of the Amphion Opera House. Life on Baker Street seemed to resume its familiar rhythms. The press denied its scandalous narrative, published a few cryptic lines on the incident of structural failure, fortunate rescue, the miraculous survival of 3 talented young musicians. Yet, beneath those bland headlines, a deeper disquiet remained a tremor in the air, as though the city itself still hummed with some buried note. Holmes threw himself into new distractions. He analyzed the foot tracks of a jewel thief in Mayfair, untangled a web of extortion surrounding a foreign embassy, to even solve the puzzle of the vanishing fireman of Camden Town Hall within a fortnight. His name began appearing again in the polite columns of the society pages, often accompanied by words of praise from the grateful, the mystified, and the powerful. To the world, Holmes was as sharp and unflappable as ever, yet to me, who had watched him pass through the crucible of the Blackheath case, there was a new quality in his silences, a wariness, almost like a man listening for footsteps behind him. He played his violin often in the early hours, selecting minor keys and unfinished melodies, leaving phrases unresolved. Sometimes I'd find him standing by the window in the deepest part of the night, gazing out into the lamplit street, as if searching for the return of someone he had lost. I, too, found myself changed. I visited the young women from the choir several more times at St. Bartholomew's. Celia was discharged first, stored in health, if not in spirit. Marianne lingered for a time, her sleep troubled by dreams she could not or would not describe. Becca's recovery was the slowest. She spoke little, but one day pressed my hand and said, "Thank you, Dr. Watson, for hearing me when I couldn't speak." The words, simple as they were, left a lasting ache. The city moved around us. Fog pressed against the windows, and the streets filled with the music of their own. Carriage wheels over stone, boot heels echoing in deserted courts, the distant rise and fall of church bells. Yet, each note seemed to carry a residue, a memory of the cantata's dreadful harmony. Even Holmes, master of the rationale, would sometimes pause, cock his head, and frown as if some subtle vibration, audible to ordinary men, was passing through the bricks and bone of the city. One cold evening, as I returned from errands near the river, I found Holmes seated by the fire with Inspector Fenchurch. The latter had grown quieter since the case, his face lined by sleepless nights and private doubts. He no longer scoffed at Holmes's eccentricities. Rather, he listened closely whenever Holmes spoke and deferred to his judgment without hesitation. "There's been another grave disturbance," Holmes, Fenchurch reported. "Not Blackheath, this time Highgate, crypt, forest, the body undisturbed, but the skull stolen. A note left behind, signed only with the same stylized crow." Holmes's face darkened, but he betrayed no surprise. "Copycat, or an acolyte. I warned you, Fenchurch. Madness, like music, lingers after the composer is gone." Fenchurch nodded. "We've questioned former patients and students of Mohi. No clear leads. But there's rumor of a society and underground circle devoted to the sonic resurrection of the past. Most dismiss it as decadent folly, but after Blackheath," Holmes pressed his fingertips together, eyes narrowing. "Keep me informed, discreetly. Let no one in the yard see the full pattern out. Yet." When Fenchurch left, Holmes sighed and glanced at me. "London does not heal, Watson," he said. "She learns to endure, but every scar is a memory waiting to be played." That night, I found myself unable to sleep. I wandered through corridors, feeling the weight of our experiences like a shroud. At last, I settled in my chair opposite Holmes, who had dozed off, his violin across his knees. As I watched him, I realized how little I truly knew of the burdens he carried. He was celebrated for his victories, but it was his failures, ones not listed in the record books, that shaped him most. The night at the Amphion would linger, I suspected, in his dreams as in mine. The next morning, Holmes awoke with a start, the violin slipping from his hands. He caught it deftly, but I saw a flicker of vulnerability quickly masked in his face. "Did I wake you?" he asked. I couldn't sleep. He studied me for a moment, then set the violin aside. "You mustn't let this case haunt you, Watson, not as it haunts me. We did all that could be done." I hesitated. "Did we?" We stopped arguing. "Yes, but there are still those who pursue his work, others who would use suffering to create their own music." Holmes gave a rare, weary smile. "Evil adapts, Watson. It changes its key, its rhythm. All we can do is listen, and when the time comes, play our part." We sat in silence, each contemplating the shadows cast by the lamp and the quiet city beyond. In that hush, I felt if not peace then, at least a kinship. We were not alone. In our vigil, the days grew shorter. Christmas approached, and with it came a sense of renewal. Holly wreaths on the doors, laughter from the markets, the city's familiar stubbornness in the face of the year's end. Yet every so often, I would catch Holmes' listening head cocked, eyes distant as if expecting some discordant note to slip into the city's winter hymn. He never spoke of the cantata again. But one night, as the first snow fell on Baker Street, he stood at the window, humming softly a fragment of some melody known only to him. In the end, the world moves on. Wounds close, music fades, and the living find their way. But the memory of that dreadful harmony, the choir without throats, lingers in the silence after the city sleeps. Quote. And so, too, do Holmes, and I keep watch ready for the next echo, the next collector, the next secret that refuses to stay buried. Echoes in the Bones, The Ripples Spread, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The closing of the year brought a hard frost to London. Streets gleamed in the weak winter sun, each lamplight wreathed with its own faint halo. The world, at least outwardly, had moved on from the terrors of the Blackheath collector. Newspapers turned to scandal and sport. The crowds jostled along Oxford Street as if nothing beneath the city's skin had ever shifted. Yet for Holmes and me, the aftershocks persisted. A sense of unfinished business hummed between us and resonance I could not entirely banish, no matter how many patients I tended or evenings I spent in cheerful company. Some cases linger in the blood, and this was one of them. As Holmes returned, in part to his public role, he gave a series of lectures at the Royal Society on cryptography and inference. He appeared at a private dinner for the Home Secretary, dazzling the company with a deduction that left a peer of the realm gaping. But in the private hours, his energy was restless, almost feverish. He would wake at midnight to re-examine the masks, shards, or the burned fragment of the cantata, then return to the window, watching for something neither of us could name. One evening, as I sorted medical journals, Holmes looked up from his armchair, his gaze fixed and intent. You've noticed it, haven't you, Watson? The city's new quiet. It is not peace, it is anticipation. I considered this. Perhaps it is only winter. No, Holmes said. There is a silence that comes from within. When one note ceases, another prepares to sound. It is as true of London as of any composition. His words echoed through my thoughts long after I retired. For in my dreams, I too felt the city's hush, as if the ground itself was listening, waiting for the first vibrations of a fresh disturbance. A week later, a letter arrived, addressed to me, not Holmes. The script was careful, unfamiliar. Its contents were brief. Dr. Watson, you do not know me, but you must listen. There are others. The cantata was never finished. The collector was but one in a chain, a wary trust. No one who comes bearing music, nor bones. There are secrets, yet unburied, in the city's heart. You will be summoned when the next voice sings. Yours, in Warninga, friend of the choir. I showed Holmes the letter at once. He examined it with his lens, sniffed the paper, even tasted a corner, as was his odd custom. No chemical signatures, cheap ink, postmarked from Lambeth. The sender is careful, Watson, but desperate. Note the pressure on the final word sings. They expect something soon, or fear it. Do you think this is a prank? Holmes shook his head. No, the city is full of shadows, but there is intent in this hand. If Argyll was a disciple, there may be others, those who wish to finish what he began, or prevent its completion. We spent the next day following up with Fenchurch, who brought us news from Highgate. Another theft, this time not a body part, the journal from a crypto diary belonging to a recently deceased choirmaster. Inside, as the vicar told us, were sketches of musical arrangements and notations on the anatomy of resonance. Holmes's eyes grew sharp. It's spreading, Watson. It's like an infection, moving from bone to mind, from body to music. The original manuscript of the cantata may not be needed any longer. The ideas have already taken root. But to what end? He gave me a long look. Resonance, as the cantata's creator believed, could awaken something not just in the dead but in the living. The right sequence, the right choir, could turn music into a weapon or a message. That night, I recorded all these details in my journal. Holmes paced the sitting room, then stopped suddenly by the mantel. It's more than one kind of collector, he said. Some seek the bones of the past. Others gather followers, ideas, fragments of belief. This is not a single case, Watson. It's a current, an undertow. The question is whether we are to be swept along, or whether we can chart its flow. His words, ominous as they were, seemed to clarify something in his demeanor. From that evening, Holmes began a new regiment of vigilance. He recruited the Baker Street irregulars to to watch for musicians or scholars with unusual obsessions. Wrote 2 experts in the anatomy of sound, seeking reports of anything strange bouts of mass hysteria at concerts, odd sounds heard in crypts, mysterious disappearances among choir singers or organists. Weeks passed. Again, one morning, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Incident at St. Bride's. Organist missing. Witnesses report him played that none could recall. Local dogs howled. Inspector requests your presence immediate. Holmes rose at once. The next note, Watson, it has begun. We donned our coats, mufflers wound tight, and plunged into the bracing winter morning. I saw then, for the first time in weeks, a hint of Holmes's old excitement, fierce light in his eyes. The joy, not just of the chase, but of standing again between London and the shadow at its door. As the cab rattled toward St. Bride's, Holmes turned to me and said, almost gently, we are the city's last defense. Watson, not just against crime, but against the madness that follows in its wake. Let us see if this new voice can be silenced before the choir swells. Once more, I nodded, heart pounding, ready to face the next darkness with Holmes at my side. In London's silent music, waiting all around us. Chapter 7, The Unfinished Score. A new verse begins, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The cab rattled through icy streets, past shuttered shops and lamplighters hunched against the wind. Holmes sat upright, every sense sharpened, gaze darting from fog-wreathed alleyways to the spires looming over Fleet Street. It was rare to see him so animated after the exhaustion of the Blackheath affair, spelled, as we neared St. Bride's, that some chord had been struck deep within him, a challenge, perhaps, or the dread certainty that the city's secret music was not yet silenced. St. Bride's itself was a monument to old London. It tiered wedding cake steeple, rising stark against the pewter dawn. The churchyard bustled with Police Inspector Fenchurch among them, directing constables and scribbling notes. He greeted us with a brisk nod, his eyes tired but alert. You came quickly. Good. I have little taste for these new cases too. Many whispers, not enough facts. The vicar is inside. He's unsettled. Holmes and I followed Fenchurch beneath the battered portico. Within, the air was chill and heavy with incense. The vicar, a stooped and scholarly man named Rev. Ellicott, waited by the great pipe organ, his hands twisted together in agitation. It happened last evening, gentlemen, he said. Mr. Evans, our organist, remained after choir practice to prepare for Sunday service. When I returned, just before midnight, the doors were locked from the inside, but no answer. We forced them at dawn. He was gone, but Ellicott hesitated, his voice dropping. Someone had been here. Holmes moved forward, scanning the scene with swift, hawk-like precision. The organ console had been disturbed. Sheet music scattered across the floor, the stops set in a peculiar pattern. Most troubling of all, a single phrase was scrawled in black chalk above the ivory keys. Nan finita. Holmes traced the letters, frowning. Not finished. Ellicott nodded miserably. We heard a hymn during the night. 9 of us recognized the tune, but it rose and fell, strangely, hollow. The dogs in the churchyard howled until dawn. Fenchurch gestured to the side aisle, where a battered satchel rested atop a pew. Found this behind the vestry, belonged to Evans. Inside only, this. He handed Holmes a thin oilskin notebook. Its pages were filled with musical notations, many ordinary, but some devolving into feverish, looping marks. At the center was a page written in a spidery, frantic hand. The choir's voice is missing its heart. I heard it call from below. There is music in the stone. The key awaits. Holmes's face grew grave. He believed he heard the cantatas echo here, or was driven to search for it. I felt a chill. Do you believe Evans is another collector roar. Another victim. Both, perhaps, Holmes said. This is not a single disease, Watson. It spreads, infects. The notes become thoughts. The thoughts become action. He paced the nave, pausing before the ancient stone steps that lead beneath the church. Did you search the crypts? Fenchurch shook his head, locked tight. No sign of forced entry, but we found muddy prints in the north passage. Holmes beckoned for a lantern and led us downward. Okay? The crypt was cold, the air sharp, with damp and mildew. Shadows crawled across stone pillars, and our footsteps rang with a peculiar, doubled echo. Holmes knelt by a patch of disturbed earth and examined a faint impression of heel, elongated and narrow. A woman's shoe, he murmured. Someone else was here with Evans. He flashed his lantern along the wall, scratched into the plaster was a jagged sigil, 3 rib bones twisted into a cleft. The crow's mark. I breathed. Yes, the new collector's signature. He rose, eyes glittering. Evans was not alone. Someone lured him or joined him in ritual. Okay? The question is, was it for music or for silence? Fenchurch's voice, low and urgent. You think he's still alive? Holmes shrugged. This is an unfinished score, a performance interrupted. If Evans has valued his musician as vessel, he may yet be alive. We followed Holmes through the crypt, noting fragments, a fallen sheet of music torn in half, candle wax dripped in a trail, toward the northernmost arch. There, behind a slatted wooden door, we found a hidden staircase spiraling even deeper beneath St. Bride's. At the bottom, the passage widened. Lying in the dust were shards of a broken tuning fork and a velvet scrap embroidered with a faint silver crow. Holmes pocketed the items, eyes narrowed. This is orchestration, Watson. Someone is rehearsing a new verse. As we ascended, a distant sound reached our ears, faint, discordant hum, as if a pipe organ were being played far beneath the city. Holmes froze, lips parted, listening intently. The music is moving, he said, softly. From crypt to crypt, voice to voice. They are searching for a resonance acquired in hiding. That afternoon, we conferred in the vestry, piecing together what little we had. Holmes drew maps of London's ancient churches, marking each with known disturbances, disappearances, or the appearance of the crow's sigil. It is a circuit, he said. New event moves farther west. The next likely target is St. Marylebone. Their choir is renowned, their organ recently restored. Fenchurch left to arrange discreet surveillance. Holmes, in a rare gesture, asked me to stay close. He trusted no one else to hear the subtle note, to recognize the hidden harmonies of the city's unfolding danger. As dusk settled, Holmes confided, we are nearing the true heart, Watson. Not merely of this case, but of a movement occult of resonance grown in the city's cracks. The cantata has become an obsession for many, and when the right voices gather, I fear London itself will be forced to listen. His gaze was distant, haunted, yet resolute. I saw in him both conductor and sentinella, man who knew that music could wound as surely as any blade. That night, as the city's bells rang out the hour, Holmes and I prepared to watch St. Marylebone. The air was thick with the promise of revelation. And in that moment, I felt the weight of every secret London had ever tried to keep. The score was not finished, and neither were we. The gathering of the choir, the resonant circle, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The evening that followed was one of strange expectancy. Holmes and I, stationed in the shadowed gallery of St. Marylebone, watched the city's life ebb and flow along Cheapside. Gaslight flickered against the old stone, casting monstrous shapes across the nave. Below us, the choir rehearsed, their voices rising pure and clear, yet every note seemed, to my ear, to tremble on the brink of discord. Holmes, half concealed behind a column, surveyed the congregation and the aisles, missing nothing. The events that St. Bride's had given him new urgency, okay? The cryptic circuit he had traced through the city's ancient churches was tightening, its circle nearly closed. The pattern had become unmistakable. At each site, a mark, a fragment of music, a disappearance, a hum that lingered long after the choirs had dispersed. "Listen, Watson," Holmes murmured, voice so low it barely disturbed the air. Not to the singing, but the silence that follows. Each choir pauses at the same measure, as if waiting for a signal. That is when the resonance is tested. The new voice weighed. Somewhere among them is our next collector. As the rehearsal drew to a close, the choir director gathered the singers for a private conversation. Holmes watched, keen-eyed, noting the furtive glances exchanged among a fua tenor, a young soprano, the organist. He jotted names into his notebook. 3 names appear on the registers at St. Bride's and St. Clement's, he whispered. They are the links, the carriers of this musical contagion. We waited until the choir filed out into the darkening street. Holmes motioned for me to follow at a distance. In the fog and foot traffic of Cheapside, we trailed the organist. Mr. Grillia, thin man with anxious eyes, his music case hugged to his chest. At Bow Lane, he paused beneath the eaves of a shuttered shop, glanced over his shoulder, and slipped through an iron gate into the rear courtyard of an old parish house. Holmes signaled, and we crept closer. A soft, urgent, filtered out. He pressed to the cracked window and caught snatches of conversation. Not yet ready. Tonight, perhaps, if the others arrive. Evans is missing, but the circle must be completed. The final measure, the echo. Holmes's face darkened. They are planning a gathering of performance. Tonight. We withdrew and hurried through the maze of alleys, Holmes explaining in hushed tones. The cantata's cult has grown bolder, no longer content to haunt crypts and forgotten passages. They are gathering their voices for a culminating act. Their leader, whoever now bears the mantle of collector, means to finish what Argyll began, using a living choir at the city's resonant heart. He paused, catching his breath. They will need an acoustically perfect space, one with history and power, the last on the Circuit Temple Church. By the time we reach Temple, the bells had struck 9. Vinchurch and 2 trusted officers, disguised as vergers, awaited us at the side entrance. Holmes explained the urgency in quick, clipped tones. They mean to gather the choir here, tonight. The performance will not be for an audience, but for the stones. If successful, the resonance may drive others to madness or awaken a mania that could sweep the city. Vinchurch nodded grimly. We have the choir list. Shall we wait for your signal? Yes. Let none leave the premises until I have spoken with the director and organist. We entered the church's candlelit gloom. The congregation was sparse of few elderly parishioners. The choir clustered in nervous knots. Holmes approached the director, Mr. Hawes, and presented his card. Forgive the intrusion. We believe your choir is at risk. There has been a pattern disappearances, music that should not be heard. The crow's mark. Hawes blanched, but then seemed to steel himself. There have been rumors, his voices heard in the crypts. 2 of our members left messages in settling. 1 vanished last week. Holmes nodded, moving swiftly to the organist. Mr. Greeley, I must ask, have you received strange music, notes you do not recognize? Greeley, visibly shaking, produced a crumpled page from his coat. This arrived by post. No return. It is not my hand, nor any composer I know. Holmes scanned the sheet fragments of the cantata's theme, interspersed with newer, stranger measures. He handed it to me. Watson, note the signature at the bottom. It was the crow, drawn over a new symbol circle with a single line, splitting it like an open mouth. Holmes looked up, eyes bright. They planned to use the choir's voices as the final instrument. Tonight, with the right sequence, the the right echoes, they hope to summon the full power of the cantata. If we do not stop them, the city may witness a wave of delirium it cannot contain. He called Fenchurch and the officers closer, giving instructions in low tones. We were to watch the choir as they prepared, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of the collector's mark or the beginning of the forbidden music. The rehearsal began. At first, it was ordinary, familiar hymns, practiced harmonies. But as the night wore on, a change swept through the choir. Their voices grew brittle, the melodies warped, the air itself seeming to vibrate with a tension that pulled at the nerves. Suddenly, Mr. Greeley stepped forward, lifting the mysterious page. The choir, as if compelled, began to sing. The sound rose a strange, haunting chord, neither sacred nor profane, but urgent, insistent, and deeply wrong. Holmes shouted now. Officers surged forward. Cinch seized Greeley's arm. I rushed to the director, who was swaying, eyes unfocused. Holmes snatched the page from the stand and tore it in two. For a moment, the discord hung in the air, then collapsed. The choir fell silent, several members weeping, others dazed, as though waking from a nightmare. Holmes turned to the gathered officers. The cantata's performance is broken for tonight, but the cult circle is not yet destroyed. There is still a leader one who orchestrates from the shadows. We must find them, and soon, or London will never know peace. As we helped the stunned choir to safety, Holmes met my gaze, a grim smile flickering. The city's harmony holds Watson, Tony, just. Chapter 8, The Devil's Conductor, The Heart Beneath the City, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The aftermath of the failed cantata at Temple Church left London trembling, as if the city itself had drawn a ragged breath and was waiting for something relief, or perhaps retribution. News of the incident was swiftly muffled. The police preferred the public believe it had been a fainting spell, a simple confusion of nerves among the choir. Only a handful of us knew how close London had come to chaos. Holmes, however, was not soothed by temporary victory. For 3 days and nights, he retreated almost entirely into his own mind. He pored over every note, name, and symbol, mapping their connections with twine and pens across the parlor wall. I caught him at odd hours, hunched over the fire, speaking to himself in fragments of Latin. Sometimes humming snatches of the cantate, time stopping with a shudder, as if the very memory scalded him. On the 4th day, Holmes summoned me to the window, his eyes ablaze with the light I had seen only at the climax of our greatest cases. It is time, Watson. The circle is closing not around us, but beneath us. He gestured to the city map, marked in crimson and black. Site Blackheath, St. Bride's, St. Marylebone, Temple, Traces, and Ark. The center lies here. His finger stabbed at a blank space near the river, the long-abandoned ossuary beneath the old St. Magnus Martyr. Sealed since the fire of '84. I caught my breath. You believe the conductor, the true master behind Argyll in these cultist waits for us there? Holmes nodded grimly. Every performance, Watson, needs its finale. The cantata's heart must be sounded where London's dead and living intermingle, in a space shaped for resonance and remembrance. We sent for Fenchurch, briefing him in whispers. By midnight, with the city deep in sleep, we met him at the crumbling iron gates behind St. Magnus. Rain fell steadily, turning the stone to glass. Holmes led the way, lantern in hand, Fenchurch and I following down into the sodden dark. The ossuary was a vast warren, lined with skulls and femurs, the dust of centuries thick underfoot. Somewhere, water dripped. Somewhere, a rat fled our approach. Our lamps sent grotesque shadows leaping along the bone-lined walls. I felt the press of the city's weight above us, a cathedral of the forgotten. Holmes moved swiftly, tracing the air with his tuning fork, listening for the faintest note. We found signs of recent passage candle stubs, crushed velvet, a scrap of sheet music stained with fresh ink. At last, we came to the central vault, a low, circular chamber where the bones were stacked in geometric patterns, spiraling inward to a dais of black stone. There, at its center, stood a man. He was older than Argyll, with a mane of silver hair and a scholar's bearing. His eyes, when they met Holmes's, were lucid to lucid, burning with fanatic joy. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice echoing in the cold air, "I wondered when you would find me. You've heard my cantata, yes? Felt it. London herself hums with it now." Holmes stepped forward, cane raised. "Dr. Aaron Fried Mulheim, I had begun to doubt you were still alive." Mulheim bowed slightly, the gesture almost courtly. "Alive is a relative term, Mr. Holmes. I have lived in many places, memory, music, and bone. This city's past called me home." Fenchurch's hand hovered at his pistol, but Holmes waved him down. "This is not a man to be threatened, Inspector. Would rather die than be denied his finale." Mulheim smiled, revealing teeth, yellowed by laudanum and neglect. "You are correct. Choir failed above. But here where the living and the dead are closest, the final resonance can still be struck." I shuddered as he produced a new page of music, notated in wild, looping hand. Around us, shapes began to move, for figures emerging from the shadows, cloaked and masked, their voices murmuring snatches of the forbidden melody. Holmes spoke, steady and strong. "The city will not listen, Doctor. We have broken your circle. The police are above. Your disciples are known. This is your end." Mulheim's face twisted with sorrow and pride. "No, Mr. Holmes, it is not I who must end. It is London's silence. The city needs to grieve to remember what it has buried beneath trade and ambition." He signaled his followers, who raised tuning forks and struck them, sending shimmering vibrations through the bones. The air trembled with resonance, a wave of sound that seemed to draw forth every sorrow the city had ever known. Holmes seized my arm. "Watson, now." We surged forward. Fenchurch and I wrestled two of the cultists to the ground. Holmes leaped onto the dais, snatching the music from Mulheim's hand. For a moment, the chamber thundered with discord cries, sobbing the bonfire's dreadful music. Holmes tore the page in two, flinging the pieces into the lantern's flame. The resonance faltered, wavered, then broke. A great sigh seemed to pass through the ossuary, as if 1,000 ghosts had found release. Heim crumpled to the floor, his eyes still wild. "You do not understand, Holmes. It is only the overture. London will always have its collectors." Holmes knelt beside him, voice soft and final. "Perhaps, but not tonight." As police streamed down the stair, we herded the cultists into custody. Mulheim was led away, silent, the cantata's last notes dying on his lips. Hours later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in the darkness, violin across his knees. I poured us both the brandy. "Will it end, Holmes?" I asked quietly, "or has something only just begun?" He looked at me, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw not only triumph, but exhausting end, just beneath a flicker of hope. "Tonight, Watson, London sleeps in peace. That is enough for me." He raised his bow and played a single, clear note. It hung in the silence, whole and unmarred. For a moment, the city and all its sorrows seemed to listen and to rest,